This tutorial covers a value and color study of a pomegranate. It's also a nice exercise in a wet on wet technique. To start off, I'm just going to mix a very light wash of a color for our flat wash over the entire pomegranate. I am going to be using the Viridian color. For the purpose of the value study, you can choose whichever color you like. Try steer away from the lighter colors. And to further benefit your value study, steer away from the red for now. So choose any other color other than red, and we are going to work at identifying our light to mid-tone to dark tones in the pomegranate. I'm keeping the reference on the left hand side so that you can see how I am mapping out the colors as I work. And as I said, this first layer is going to be our flat wash layer. I'm just covering the entire area with this green, and later on, while it is still damp, I will lift for further highlights. For this bit of pooling that's happening at the top here, I'm going to use a sweeping brush stroke just to pull it into the rest of my flat wash, and then you won't obviously need to pick up any more paint. I've used what is there available to me on the paper. While this layer is still wet, I am going to dip straight into the pigment and start plotting in my darkest shades. I like to work this way so that I can more easily blend out to a mid-tone. Because my bottom layer is damp, it makes it easy to do this in a wet and wet technique. So I'm mapping out those dark tones, working as quickly as I can because the layer is still damp, but remembering also that this layer is going to dry, so I need to work as fast as I can. And then as I continue, I might add a bit more water just to thin this pigment down. As explained in the lessons with me, I would have told you why we would do a value study. It's to identify those value shifts, and then even I go to the extent of making people work upside down if they are getting hindered by the actual subject. So the block might come because your whatever you're painting is not looking like a pomegranate. So we flip it upside down and you start training your eye to actually paint what you see rather than what you think you see or know. So having a tonal representation of our reference or a monochromatic grayscale version of our reference, we are using this as a study so that we can plot in those tonal shifts before we actually even get into our color exercise. I haven't mapped out with outlines where my highlights and midtones and shadows are, but I'm going to use my clean damp brush. So I've rinsed it off, wiped it off, and I'm going to lift to restore some of my highlights. While you are working, you might start to notice sections of your painting starting to dry, and it's at this point where I will then clean off my brush and wipe it off to remove any excess water, and then I'll just blend from my highlights towards the shadows to soften those hard edges, and you'll see me bringing this into play now. So I've cleaned off, wiped off, and I will go in at the highlight and just drag that pigment into the highlighted section so that it's a softer blurred edge. I can see that the crown portion of my pomegranate is quite dry, so I'm going to go in with pigment at this point and make it quite dark. And the reason I am tackling this now while it's dry is so that it doesn't bleed into the rest of my pomegranate. When you see me tapping off onto my paper towel as well, that's just to remove any excess pigment so that I'm not going in with a big ball of paint on the end of my brush. Once I've plotted in the darker pigment sections, I'll rinse off and wipe off my brush, and then I will use the dragging technique just to bring that pigment into the remaining section of the crown, but as a soft blur and not like a hard line. So there's a nice little blend from dark to light happening here. So this first layer is already starting to dry, and it's kind of where a lot of my students find a stumbling block, is because you are re-wetting that underpainting and starting to lift pigment off at the same time. So the trick is to be quick on the blending. I want to increase my contrast, so I've gone in with stronger pigment, but in the highlight sections you'll see me just pulling a clean damp brush in and dragging into the darker color to create a softer blend, so no hard lines. On the bottom shadow of the pomegranate, I am going to use a clean, damp brush just to soften the hard edge of that shadow. With pigment straight from the pan, I am just going to be adding a few of the more contrast details to my crown. Where I block in the shadows of my crown, I will also use a clean damp brush once I've laid in this hard color, just to soften off those hard edges. So I clean off my brush, I wipe off any excess water, and now I'm just blurring those hard lines. For further contrast, I'm also going to be adding in more of the pure pigment for those darkest values. And again, as I've explained, a clean damp brush just to smooth out any hard lines. Because watercolor is a transparent medium, lifting is as much part of the painting process as actually putting the pigment onto the page. So you want to remember that because we don't use white in watercolors, we lift to restore our highlights and then obviously water our paint down for our lighter tones. We never add white to our watercolor pigment. This is just a side note explanation, but the reason why we don't add white is because it loses that sort of beautiful opulence when you paint on white paper. So it's more of a reflective white when you use the natural paper white. But if you use white in pigment form by adding it to your other pigments, it makes the paint a little bit more opaque, and then also mattifies it and sort of creates a pastel version of that color. So when you start mixing your more opaque pastel versions with our lovely vibrant pure pigments, it can start looking quite muddy. To finish off, I'm adding in the final shadows that I want to pop in place, and then I'm just gonna do a final lift for any highlights that I want to keep in my composition. It's not always easy to know when enough is enough and to pull back from painting and overworking something, but I'm quite happy to leave it here. I feel like my value study is as good enough a representation that I need to show me that I understand where my highlights are, where my midtones are, and where my shadows are. I'm going to move on to the pomegranate study in color now. And to start off, I'm going to prepare a mix of the azo yellow color just to set the undertone of the pomegranate. It is quite a warm pomegranate that has like an orangey red pulling through. So just to set the undertone, I'm going to flat wash with yellow, and then I'm going to build up my darker colors. So in watercolor, we do always start with our lightest values first, and that's also why I'm setting my undertone or my flat wash in the yellow color. So while this layer is still wet, I am going to start preparing an orange sort of color. I've mixed it just into what was left of my yellow, and I am going to plot in the darkest values again. So I'm using this orangey red mix that I've made, and I'm blocking in those sort of mid-tone and dark values, and then once this is blocked in, I'll start laying in the darker values. When I work wet on wet, I am normally quite generous with pigment in that I use it straight from the pan, but I have very little on the end of my brush, and a little goes a very long way. So I'm blocking in these colors, but you'll see that I don't reach for any water and I'm not reaching for any pigment right now. I'm just blocking in those colors and using the water that's already on the paper to blend out. Where I might have gone too dark, I'll rinse off and wipe off, and then just lift off to restore that highlighted section. I'm going to move on to the darker values now. I've rinsed off, wiped off my brush, and I'm picking up the Madder Lake Deep. I'm working quite quickly and my painting is luckily still wet on the page. So when I do block in my darker values, it bleeds quite nicely into what is still wet on the page. And now I am just blending what I want to around the pomegranate into the darker sections. And I will layer up on this to bring in more of the dark tones as I work. Where it is darker on the reference, I am trying to capture that now in the blended wet on wet method, just so that those values are nice and contrasted when I am coming in back later to like capture those final details in the painting. Again, just to soften and restore my highlights, I'm going in with a clean damp brush just to pick up any paint. So I do wipe off in between strokes so that I'm not ending up mixing any paint in the I'm now mixing a darker tone, so I am picking up the Madder Lake Deep and the Burnt Umber, making a richer red color, and eventually I'll also add a bit of the Payne's Grey into my mixture to like amp up the contrast even more. So right now this is just a mix of the Madder Lake Deep and the Burnt Umber to start laying in the darker values of the pomegranate. And as you can see, some of the sections on my pomegranate are drying already. So I'm plotting in dark colors where I want them. And now I've gone in with a clean damp brush just to soften those lines a little bit more. I'm going to paint in some of the finer detail around the crown, more the shadows. So I'm going to plot in these value shifts, and I'm going to use a clean damp brush to blur out any of the hard lines and blend it into this area of the pomegranate. This next part of the pomegranate is where we go even deeper in color. So I am preparing a Mad Lake Deep mixed with Payne's Grey and Burnt Umber to make it a bit deeper. With time, obviously my layers underneath are drying, so I am going to more frequently dip into my water, rinse off and wipe off so that there's no excess moisture on the brush, and I will lift off and blur out those hard lines to make it a more seamless blend. On the inside of the crown, I have blocked in the darker colors, and I'm going to go in with a clean damp brush just to blur things out. I've mixed a much darker color for the inside of the crown, and I'm just blotting off any excess paint before I go in and paint the finer details of the inside of the crown. And lastly, I'm going to paint the bottom shadow of the pomegranate. So I've mixed quite a dark color here, and I'm going to go in wet on dry and then use the dragging method just to blur out the hard line. As a final suggestion for when you are painting your value and color studies of the pomegranate is when you are asking yourself the question, when is a good time to stop, or am I overworking this? That's a great time to put your paintbrush down and step away from the painting and rather to come back like 12 hours or 24 hours later to re-look at it, or make yourself a cup of tea, come back and see if there is actually anything further needed for your value study or your color study. So these are just quick studies that we've done for the purpose of this lesson. If you were painting something like this for composition, you would work a little bit slower and a little bit more carefully, but just to understand that lesson of identifying your highlights to midtones to your darkest shadows, I'm happy to leave this here. And yeah, well done. Thank you so much for watching.